This is a facial image derived from an ancient burial cloth. Is this the face of Jesus Christ? Took courage and went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And Pilate wondered if Jesus were already dead. And summoning the centurion, Pilate asked the centurion whether Jesus was already dead. And when he learned from the centurion that Jesus was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. And Joseph bought a linen shroud, and taking Jesus down, wrapped Jesus in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock. Now the question is, can you and I trace that burial cloth of Jesus to the cloth that is now at Turin, Italy, called the Shroud of Turin? We have to recognize that the historical date of the death of Jesus is probably 30 AD, since our calendar is wrong, sometime around there. Now, it would seem very true that the Shroud of Turin has been actually a cloth called in the Greek church the mandilion, or a face of Jesus from ancient times, which was brought from Jerusalem, according to legend, to Edessa in 525. We certainly know it's here at Edessa, in Asia Minor, from 525 on, and it leads artists to paint Jesus as he looks on the shroud cloth. In 944, it was taken to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and then apparently in 1204, since it was taken out of Constantinople by the members of the Fourth Crusade, it must have been the Knights Templar, as far as we can tell, who took it to France. And when the Knights Templar were put out of existence by Philip the Fair, then the shroud was kept secretly until in the middle 1300s, sometime between 1353 and 1357, it certainly came into historical existence. This is the most important date in the history of the shroud, because if the shroud is a forgery, forgery would have occurred before this time in the middle 1300s. It was given to the House of Savoy 100 years later, and it came to Chambéry, France, where in 1532 there was a great fire that burned out a corner of the cloth. Then brought to Turin in 1578, and it's been there ever since. Now, the expositions of the shroud are more or less, let's say 3 or 4 a century. For example, in 1868, 1898, and then after 1898, 1931, and 1933. But the greatest exposition occurred in 1978 when 3,300,000 people saw the shroud. You should recognize, too, at that time, people saw the shroud for the first time in its natural light shades. Notice particularly how little contrast there is in the shroud when you see it as it was in its container in the Cathedral of Turin. The very faintness is another argument against any possibility of forgeries, because, you see, the pictures that we have will be high contrast photography, and they show us things that we could not see with the naked eye. Now, we have to admit that we cannot have a logical link by history between the Shroud of Turin today and the crucified Jesus Christ. We have to use instead logic, and the logic is indirect. There are two questions, and a lot of people do not make this distinction. First of all, you have to say, did the body of a human being put these marks on the cloth? That is a second, or I should say that is completely distinct from the second question, which is this: is that body the body of Jesus Christ? Most of the evidence now that I'm going to show you will discuss the question whether or not the shroud could be a forgery, whether a body put the marks on the cloth. The second question, though, about the identification is one of coincidences, and by mathematical chances, you will see why I suggest to you that if we say the unusual things happening to the man of the shroud and to Jesus Christ happen to only one other person, that would take one chance in a billion times a billion times a billion that this man could be anyone else but Jesus Christ. Now, what happened in 1898? At the 1898 exposition, for the first time in history, Secundo Pia, an amateur photographer, was taking a picture of what he thought something like this. Then, to his utter astonishment, he saw this. On his camera negative, in normal lights and shadows, there popped out the body of a man who certainly had been crucified, and he appears to be 170 pounds in weight. He's about 5 feet 10 inches high. He's been scourged, and his head has been crowned with something. Now, could this be Jesus Christ? And Secundo Pia suddenly realized what this logic meant. He had the evidence that the shroud had the characteristics of a photographic negative, yet it's been in existence for centuries, long before the camera was invented. Who could forge a photographic negative centuries before the camera? Why would anybody do it? And yet the shroud is not a complete photographic negative, because there appear to be transferred blood stains, which you will see very clearly in a few moments. Those are photographically positive. Most people, though, get distracted by the shroud. When they see the pictures, they wonder what the marks are along its side. You see it's got apparent scorch marks from its history and from the fire where the corners had been burned out. So suppose I demonstrate to you now how the cloth covered the body. We have here a mannequin which is more or less scale size, and so is this cloth. The shroud itself is 14 feet, 3 inches long, and 3 feet 7 inches wide. If we uncover it in this way, we'll see, first of all, that this body of the man made a dorsal imprint or back imprint on the shroud from here to here. Notice that here is what appears to be a chin band, and this goes under the chin of the man and over the top, so that on the shroud there are no markings right here. Then notice that the left wrist is turned over the right very stiffly. The left leg is drawn up and turned in this way, and evidently one nail was used to crucify the left foot over the right foot. This is how we get a dorsal or back imprint, and then with the chin band here, we get a frontal imprint with the cloth turning over it. But something else. You must remember that in history, we know that in 1532, the shroud was almost burned, destroyed. Instead, a drop of molten silver fell on a corner of the cloth, burned it out at various levels. And you see, since this corner was burnt out, then when the cloth was unfolded, that burn reproduced itself again and again and again. And so it was that 2 years after the fire, namely in 1534, the poor Clare nuns in Chambéry put patches in the cloth. And those are the triangular patch marks that you see on the shroud again and again. What can we say about this? Actually, we have to ask ourselves, let's first of all get a summary of what is on the cloth. We have here life-size replicas. These are certainly not the genuine shroud pictures, but they are photographs of the shroud. And first of all, this is life-size of the way the shroud looks on a high-contrast photographic reproduction. We don't see much. The burn marks are on each side, the scorch marks from the fire and its history, what appears to be a grotesque face, grotesque body, and water marks on the cloth, apparent blood stains that now are here dark compared to the stains that are photographically negative, not too much to see. But then when we look at it on our photographic negative, everything snaps into focus. The face of the man of the shroud with a beauty and a dignity that is beyond us to explain. And apparently where the flesh has been opened, marks came on the cloth again and again. Here's the water mark, again, from the time of the fire when the cloth was doused with water. And then here, look at the 4 fingers, no thumbs showing for a very unusual reason I'll tell you later. 4 fingers, no thumbs showing, and here the nail wound is in the wrist area. We go down from the thighs down to the knees. Notice how the knees are turned properly to fit the angle of the legs and back. And here even the curve of the calf shows so normally. It's this perfect physiology that makes so many experts say that the shroud cannot be forged. Even if you had a medieval who could paint a photographic negative, what medieval could ever know physiology so well? Now on the dorsal or back imprint, notice how the imprints start up here, this line, and here's the back of the forehead. So at the very top of the head, there are no imprints on the head of the man of the shroud. This is the back of the head where the man has had not just a circlet of bleeding, but a veritable cap. And then back and forth, the flesh seems to have been carved open or cut open or just burst open by something that whipped that poor man. And then here at the kidney level, the heart blood came down the ribs and collected off here in a pool to the left. We don't see much more on the dorsal or back imprint. But when we look at it on our photographic negative, again, what a difference. The back of the head with the blood stains showing light and positive, and here the back where the man has been whipped again and again, the blood flow at the kidney level, the rigor mortis showing in the stiff buttocks of this man as he rests in the tomb, and here the thighs with the scourge mark showing, the bend of the knees, even what it should be again, with the fact that you have those 2 feet, namely the left foot drawn up this way and the right that way. But the claims of the shroud are so stupendous, you and I must subject it to a serious discussion. and say from a historical viewpoint, can it be the body of Jesus or not? We look first of all at the face. This is 2 times the normal size. Our photograph, I should remind you, is much higher in contrast than anything you would see if you saw the shroud with your own eye. But to our surprise, whereas earlier people thought that all you could see was this grotesque face, we now can use this as evidence of the history of the shroud cloth. It's this. Both Dr. Vigneault and Ian Wilson, a British historian, call attention to the fact that apparently the shroud influenced the pictures of Jesus. From the 500s on, we have a type of Jesus like this, with the cloth, I should say really with the locks of hair that are on the cloth down here. The eyes are open. Look at the beard and then the mustache. And over here, what seems to be a circlet of bleeding. Now, in the typical pictures of Jesus from the Eastern Church, these points are reproduced again and again. In fact, the lights and shadows show themselves just where the lights and shadows are on this negative photograph, which is telling us that evidently the shroud must have been folded into fourths or quarters, that is fourths, so that ancient artists saw only the face, and therefore they thought it was a miraculous face of Jesus. They copied lights and shadows just as a photographic negative would be. But look what happens to us when we know what it means to take a picture. We take a picture of this, and on our camera negative, we see this. The face of the man of the shroud. Who is this? Is this Jesus Christ? It seems too good to be true. If it isn't Jesus, we say, who else could it be? We notice, for example, the 2 locks on each side, the circlet of bleeding, following the laws of geometry, from a 3-dimensional line, 2 dimensionals, the beaten cheek, the welt here on the face, the mustache, the 2-forked beard falling away to the left. This in itself is evidence enough. But something else happened. In the mid-1970s, 2 scientists, Dr. John Jackson and Dr. Eric Jumper, came out with a new idea. They tried taking pictures of the shroud, applying those pictures to what was called an image analyzer, the same technique used in taking pictures of the planets, namely to show a 3-dimensional source when a source was there. And sure enough, the pictures of the shroud proved that there was a 3-dimensional source. Look at the face now. Now, what Jackson and Jumper found, to their surprise, was that over the eyes there appeared to be discs. What else could these be than coins, which according to ancient Jewish custom were put on the eyes? Here I have a replica, in fact it's a true coin, one of the coins put out by Pontius Pilate in the years 29 to 36 AD. Notice it has very prominently on back of it what we call a liduus, an astrologer's staff, and Pilate's coins are the only ones that have this marking on them. Now, notice that in this sketch you see a coin that's much like the one I just showed you. These coins are not identical. You should remember that they differ among themselves, one way or the other. But in general, you find the ending letters of Tiberiu Kaiseros, of Tiberius Caesar, starting at 10 or 11 o'clock and going to 1 o'clock or so. Now look what we have on the shroud itself. It's a very great surprise. We're going to be looking at that right eye, and we will be reproducing it in larger and larger size. We're getting closer and closer. And these pictures were found under high magnification and using high contrast. And I myself was one of the most surprised persons when I said, it looks as though I have an astrologer's staff here. It looks like the letters, the closing letter of Tiberiu Kaiseros, the U-C-A-I. The C is evidently a coin man's mistake, but the U is just where it should be for Tiberiu. The C is where the K should be. The A and I are there. Can it be then we are seeing the imprints of a coin from Pontius Pilate? Do you know what this means? This means that the shroud, if this theory is true, the shroud is then dated to the time of Pontius Pilate in a way we could otherwise never do by any scientific method. And in addition, this would mean a final proof that hoaxing was out of the question for the shroud. Now suppose we look at some other evidence on the shroud. First of all, in the heart area, this is a wound 5.5 inches long in the side between the 5th and 6th ribs. And this means that the spear, whatever made this opening, went up from the ribs. It pierced the right auricle. The right auricle of the heart is the only heart that has blood in it when a person dies. And this would fit physiology. Now in this heart wound, it's large, it's made by a large instrument, it's very watery, made after this man died. And we suddenly realize that in the Gospel of St. John we are told that the heart of Christ was pierced after he died and blood and water came forth. Now look at the picture of this heart wound as it would appear. This was taken simply 1 inch away from the container at Turin, where the shroud was exhibited to the public. That is 5.5 inches long. And see how faint the background marks are in the shroud, and at the same time how the watery wound is there for the heart. That's why it's so striking. We now then go to the wrist area. I would remind you that we first look at what we have here on the shroud itself. This is a wound 1.5 inches long. You don't see much. It's grotesque. And I should tell you that in history, that was one of the objections against the shroud historically. People said, we can't see anything. In fact, before I go any farther, I have to answer one question you're probably thinking of. Why hasn't he said something about what put the marks in the cloth? And all I have to tell you is, I wish I knew. No one to this date has ever suggested any final theory. We don't know. The best theory scientifically is that some type of radiation put the marks here to make the marks photographically negative. But we cannot reproduce them ourselves. We have the shroud, and it's something like a corpse in an Agatha Christie mystery. We have the evidence, we have to explain it. Now look at our photographic negative on this wrist wound. I told you before there'd be 4 fingers, no thumbs showing, and Dr. Barbet, the Paris pathologist, tells us why. Barbet figured out that if there's a nail through the wrist right here, not in the palm, but in the wrist, the only place where a body could be supported, it would hit the median nerve, and this would bring the thumbs into the palm. And this is why physiologically we have only the 4 fingers, no thumbs showing. Something else. You must remember that that hand was against a crossbar. This man was certainly crucified, no doubt about that. The blood stain goes in this direction. Notice then that if you lift your hand to this level and want to see when will that blood stain fall to the ground, you find it's at a 25-65 degree angle, which is exactly what we find if we suspend a human body, whether male or female, from a crossbar. We sink to this angle, 25-65 in here. And the very shroud shows this, namely that the wrist wound went to the ground, gives us a plumb line, which is another indication that this is true physiology. This man was truly crucified. Nobody could forge point after point after point. Photographic negatives, bleeding both before and after death, and indications of detail that are otherwise unknown. Look at the area of the wrist. You see how it's 1.5 inches long on the shroud. This is a reproduction about 6 times as large. You realize 1.5 inches from here to here, 2 inches from here to there. Look at the herringbone twill. How could anybody forge a herringbone twill of this sort? It's a weave that was not known in the Middle Ages, and several other things to say about it. A herringbone twill is known as existing in Egypt all the way back to 1,000 years before Christ. But something else? Professor Reyes of Louvain found in the early 1970s that in this linen there were microscopic bits of cotton. And not just plain cotton, but cotton which under the microscope had twists about 8 per centimeter. We have to realize that different types of cotton have different numbers of twists. For example, in the United States, cotton grown over here will have 20 or 25 twists per centimeter. The cotton found here has 8 or 10 or something like that, and this fits the type of cotton grown in the Middle East. Still more, and perhaps the greatest surprise came when Dr. Max Fry suggested his evidence from pollen. And this is what he found out of 48 microscopic type of pollen on the shroud. 13 of them come exclusively from Palestine, and they are growing in Israel today. This is a point, again, which is beyond forgery, because how would anybody know anything of this sort? Now, suppose we go to the dorsal or back image and ask ourselves what's here. Sometimes people think you have to see everything on the photographic negative. It's not so. I already pointed out that the chin band went across the top, and I'll remind you, it comes from here to here, so there's no imprint at the very top of the head. Then it starts here, and for many people, this is one of the most moving parts of the shroud, namely the mark, not just of a circle of the bleeding, but this man has had his whole head plowed open by something that looked like a crown of thorns. The beaten back looks as though it's been open in spots and spots. And I remind you, this is high contrast, which in normal photography you would see only under high contrast. You could not see the faint markings of the shroud if you saw it in real life. This bleeding, I also want to remind you, came from the heart and came down here along the ribs, and then it comes to a fold, really a collection, a little pool of blood over here at the left, because the body is turned to the left. But look what we see when we look at our photographic negative. Everything snaps into shape. The crown of apparently thorns at the back of the head. Look at the beating here. This man has been whipped terribly. Crisscross at this level, where the executioner evidently could not reach crosswise. He reached up, crisscross. Look where the whipping is horizontal here, sharper at the thigh, and almost the angle of a golf club with the ground to the calves. Most striking for physiological evidence, we have the fact that the buttocks are rigid, with rigor mortis. This tells the pathologist something, namely that this man has been dead between 5 and 10 hours at most, because after that time rigor mortis leaves the body. How could any medieval hoaxer ever know all this? Because these are mysteries in the shroud which fool us. We ourselves can't understand them. Still something else. After the scourging, do you realize that there are imprints here on the backs, here and here, which photography again brings out? See, that some type of abrasion came out darker and printed itself on the cloth. And over here, it's the lighter spots. And then we realize that we now know that a man who carried his cross would not carry it across a shoulder, anything like this, but he'd carry only the crossbar, and he'd have to walk through the street something like this. And sure enough, the man of the shroud has abrasions on his back where something opened the skin. One more point. Someone has said with regard to the shroud that it's a simple mountain of evidence, circumstantial evidence that's cumulative. And if people find difficulty with one argument, there are a dozen others just like it. Look further at the feet on the back. We're going to follow the dorsal imprint on the shroud itself. Something very, very faint, but photography brings out way down here, where the bleeding started here just back of the toes, and then after death, there was a renewed bleeding. It would take advanced blood chemistry to interpret this. And today, we ourselves cannot even forge it, namely, that when there was an original bleeding when the man was alive, one type of blood flow fell down to the heel. Then in the tomb, there'd be renewed bleeding, lymphus serous exudate, that dissolved the earlier clot, as it were. And yet these blood stains are not clots as such. They're anatomically perfect. Something else should be said, very, very important. The greatest event of the 1978 exposition was the fact that more than 30 men and women from the Shroud of Turin Research Project participated in scientific tests of the shroud. Now, the data from those scientific tests will be with us for years. They still have to be studied and brought out for people to know. But there's one very, very important thing we should remember, that at the very same time that these scientists completed their work, and this was Saturday morning, October the 14th, 1978, they said they were already able to announce their scientific proof was this: there is no pigment on the cloth making these marks. There's no pigment on the cloth at all. So we have the shroud with us, and we don't see how it could be anything but the body of a crucified man. Now we say, crucified like Jesus Christ? Look at the arguments we have. This man was evidently a Palestinian. If the coin argument means anything, this man was crucified in the time of Pontius Pilate, sometime between 29 and 36 AD. The cotton would seem to come from the area of Palestine. This man was a Jew because he has the chin band on each side of the face, a Jewish custom. He has also the chin band around the chin going to the top of the head, and then the locks on each side of the face. Then this man was crucified. It's a hasty burial. It's an individual burial. It's a rich burial, and all of this is unusual. And we realize from the gospel that Jesus Christ was buried hastily because Good Friday afternoon was approaching the evening of the Sabbath, and the body had to be taken off the cross. And so it was hastily buried. There was no time to wash it. That's what the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us. This man was scourged and crucified. Notice, that's an unusual thing. Normally, the scourged man was freed. But this man was scourged and then crucified in addition. And that's what Pontius Pilate did to Jesus Christ. This man was certainly mocked as a king. And how many crucified men, robbers, and all the rest would be mocked as a king? Most unusual, this man had his heart pierced. Why would any crucified man have his heart pierced at all? And then we have to say this heart was pierced after death. The most unique of all the unusual things. We remember that in the gospel story of Jesus Christ, the legs of the thieves were broken. And the reason for that was so that the weight of the body would bring about their death. Jesus Christ had already died. See, people sometimes wonder in this, why did crucifixion bring death? As far as we can tell, the reason is because there was cramping of the chest muscles. And the crucified man, we have to say with horror, had to stand on his crucified legs, as it were, to take the weight off his crucified hands. Now, the man of the shroud does not have his legs broken. And we are told in the Gospels that Jesus Christ did not have his legs broken as the thieves did. Something else that's most unusual. Why would anyone save this cloth? Why would any family keep in its history so gruesome a relic of such a horrible, disgraceful death? unless something magnificently unexpected happened to take all the sting and all the suffering and all the failure and all the pain out of it. There's no decomposition in his body. And does that mean that this cloth was taken off the body before anything could happen to the body? Evidently so. Scientifically speaking, we have to remind ourselves the body is certainly in rigor mortis, the stiffness of death. And that tells us that any pathologist looking at this body will tell you within 5 to 10 hours after that man died, these marks were made on the cloth. We wonder, does this lead us to the resurrection of Jesus Christ? We have to say, who knew when and how to remove that cloth from the body? The answer is we don't know. Sometimes people ask, can a scientific study of the shroud lead to the resurrection of Jesus Christ? I personally do not think so, because the resurrection is a dogma of Christian faith. Faith beyond human study and human laws. But the fact of the historicity of Jesus Christ actually living and dying for us is present on the shroud. And that's why we don't make a statement, but we make a supposition. If the body of the man of the shroud rose from the dead, then with the qualities of the glorified body of Jesus Christ, that body would go through the cloth just like gas. And the gas would collapse, I should say the cloth would collapse like a pricked balloon, and the blood stains would be left undisturbed. And that's the biggest mystery of the shroud. Why are those blood stains so perfect? Perfect, as though they came from the cloth itself, reflecting bleeding both before and after death? You and I must admit, the shroud certainly does this. It reminds us of a just man, and Christianity would say the just man, the Son of God, who suffered. A just man, an innocent man, who took suffering and death and failure on himself. It's the reminder for you and me that when suffering, death, and failure come into our lives, and we see this in the world around us, we must not think that God has simply deserted us. God is with us, and God has his own plan. And in the plan of God, the suffering of Good Friday comes to the glory of Easter Sunday. And just like in the case of Jesus Christ, the peace of God will be with us forever. And that is my prayer for you. May the peace of God be with you forever. Thank you.